we're going to wait a minute or two here for everyone to be added to the virtual auditorium, as it were, because it takes a few seconds for the system to do that. Close my door. Let's see. I think we're there right now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilmette Institute's first web talk for November of 2017. Today, we're going to have Dr. Robert Atkinson speak about From Duality to Oneness, a Baha'i perspective on humanity's conscious evolution. I should probably start and introduce the Wilmette Institute a little bit, just to let you know who it is that's hosting this. I put this on every single web talk, and we usually don't record it for the YouTube broadcast. We were established in January of 1995 by the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, and we ran a face-to-face program for 10 years. But during that face-to-face program, we also started online courses in 1998 when the software was really quite primitive, and I mean that quite literally. I won't regale you with the problems we had. But since then, we've had 437 online courses with a total of 11,674 registrants for those courses from 123 countries. So we've really had quite a record of success, and we're, of course, continuing with about 50 or 60 courses a year now. Those students have made all kinds of presentations about the Baha'i faith or related topics as a result of taking the courses, to classes, study circles, feasts, conferences, over the radio, all sorts of different situations. And we've now branched out. We're now doing 2 of these web talks a month, and we may start other kinds of web talk series in the future, depending on what we can handle, of course. We've also increasingly begun to publish student projects on our website, and we're also now in the position to give credit for some of our courses, because 6 of our courses are available for credit through the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities up in Minnesota. And for that to happen, we're also busily professionalizing our organization, and we are going to have a $100,000 fundraising goal this year. So we're hoping people will continue to contribute and strengthen the Institute's capacities. Today, Robert Atkinson will be our speaker. He's an internationally acknowledged authority on life story interviewing, personal myth making. I'd like to hear more about that, and soul making. He's published 9 books. The Story of Our Time, From Duality to Interconnectedness to Oneness is one of his most recent titles, and I think that the talk today is based a lot of the ideas from that particular book. It's been, received some very good feedback and reviews from various people. Dr. Atkinson has a BA in Philosophy and American Studies, an MA in American Folk Culture, and also a master's degree in counseling. And his PhD is in cross-cultural human development from the University of Pennsylvania. So, having completed the introduction, we will now switch over to Bob Atkinson, and he will give us his presentation for the day. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you, Rob. It's great to be with you. Let me get this slideshow set up. Okay. Yeah, it's really great to be part of this new tradition unfolding at Wilmette Institute. It's amazing what a global resource this has already become. All these web talks and courses is just a sign of the age we're in, how much is available, how much good stuff is available on the web today. So where we're going to start from today is, let me get to that. Okay. Where we're starting from with this today is knowing that we individually and collectively are on a journey in which our consciousness evolves and expands. This is one of the most important insights into understanding reality that we can have, because this right away implies and gives us great meaning, purpose, and hope. So the talk today and for the next 2 weeks after this is pretty much taken from my new book, which is really meant for a wide-ranging audience. It's designed to not only provide a missing perspective on what unifies the world's wisdom traditions, but also to add something new and unique to the somewhat popular and scholarly literature on how, why, and in what direction humanity's conscious evolution is unfolding. So I wanted to start with Rumi, because he really sees the big picture from a unifying perspective. But of course, that's what all the great mystics do. The lamps are different, but the light is the same. One matter, one energy, one light mind, endlessly emanating all things. Ground yourself, strip yourself down to loving silence. Stay there until you see you are gazing at the light with its own ageless eyes. This really gets to the heart of how we move from a consciousness of duality to a consciousness of oneness. And it all comes back to that the last two lines. Until you see you are gazing at the light with its own ageless eyes. That'll be a theme that becomes pretty evident throughout the talk and the next two talks as well. But first, before I get any further, I wanted to give you a bit of my background and a few of the key experiences that provide me with a big picture view of things. And so this does go back to my memoir, Remembering 1969, because that's when all those key events started happening for me. And just briefly, it was on July 20th, 1969, when I was a counselor at a summer camp, and all the campers and counselors were gathered anxiously around a small TV on a dining hall table, watching the moonwalk. Pretty soon we saw another angle, the Earth floating peacefully through the heavens with no boundaries. This fresh glimpse of reality helped me and many others realize that all of humanity shares a common destiny. A few days later, I noticed a local headline in the local newspaper about the Hudson River sloop Clearwater arriving in Port Jefferson, which is nearby. I remembered the year before when I met Pete Seeger, and he told me about raising money to build a replica of an old cargo sloop to sail the Hudson and help clean up the river. So I went over to Port Jeff, found the Clearwater, and spoke to Pete Seeger, who invited me to sail with him on the maiden voyage to Albany, so we could talk more about a project of gathering the stories of the people who remembered what the river was like in the days of the sloops. At South Street Seaport in New York a few days later, Pete Seeger stood on the stage as an eager, enthusiastic crowd surrounded him and said, "Who's going to clean up this river of ours? No polluter, no politician is going to lift a finger unless we insist on it. We're all in this environmental thing together. Everything in the world is tied together. You clean up a river, and soon you have to work on cleaning up society." So that was my first direct experience of social activism, the environmental movement, and social justice work all in one. A couple of weeks later, when the Clearwater arrived in Albany, a few of us crew members went over to the Woodstock Festival, and you're probably pretty familiar with what happened there. But it really was an experience of interconnectedness and oneness like no other, even through all the heat, rain, and mud. A few months later, after I had met Joseph Campbell at one of his Cooper Union talks, on one of my visits to his home in Greenwich Village, he gave me a signed copy of The Masks of God, Creative Mythology, in which he wrote that the series confirmed for him, quote, "a thought I have long and faithfully entertained of the unity of the human race, not only in its biology, but also in its spiritual history, which has everywhere unfolded in the manner of a single symphony, with its themes irresistibly advancing to some kind of mighty climax. So for me, it became clear that the emerging frame of reference is the whole rather than any of its parts. One planet, one people seemed to be the rallying cry of our time, even in the late 60s. And around this time was also when Bucky Fuller had popularized the idea of spaceship Earth. The interesting thing about all these efforts or movements of the 1960s, including civil rights, women's rights, and so many others, is that, as Pete Seeger knew, they're all interconnected. They're all tied together. All the social and spiritual movements of our time are part of a larger, all-inclusive movement, as we'll see in this and the next two web talks coming up. So here's what we're going to talk about today, an overview of the topics. We're going to start out with a big picture perspective, and we're going to take a look at consciousness as a potentiality, then love as the underlying force of evolution, and then justice as the unifying force of creation, and finally the idea that consciousness evolves toward unity and oneness. Then we'll have some time for reflection and dialogue. So, starting with a big picture perspective means understanding that reality is one, and we'll come back to this in a number of ways. It also means understanding that religion is one knowledge system that evolves over time, just like our understanding of science does, and that it develops just like human beings do through stages, and that, like nature itself, goes through cycles too. We'll talk more about that in the third talk in this series. So nature could be another word for reality. And here Abdu'l-Baha says, nature is subject to a sound organization, to invulnerable laws, to a perfect order, and to a consummate design. All things, from the smallest invisible atom to the largest globes in the world of existence, are all subject to one universal law from which they never depart. So this one universal law expresses identifiable patterns from which principles and laws are drawn. And just recently, let me go back to the last slide for me. And just recently, science caught up with this perennial spiritual truth in saying that the entire universe obeys the same fundamental laws of nature. So this perfect order of nature creates observable patterns such as cycles of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and renewal, like the cycle of the seasons and the rise and fall of civilizations that lead to the discovery of principles and natural laws, both physical and spiritual, because they are mirror reflections of the same reality. The most important of all these cycles may be the cycle of spiritual epochs. So this is a way not only of understanding humanity's conscious evolution, but also of understanding religion as an evolving system of knowledge. Spiritual epochs have clearly punctuated humanity's conscious evolution. And the founders of the world's major religions have each in their own time not only impacted the world, but also changed the course of life over the last 4,000 years by bringing about a leap of consciousness with each new epoch they have initiated. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to touch on some of the highlights of each of these spiritual epochs. In prehistory, there was the indigenous traditions era on all continents each with their own spiritual teachers, including shamans and other intermediaries between the two worlds. Tribal histories have preserved those names, and these teachings focus on harmony, balance, and oneness with all creation. Then the Hebrew-Judaic era began in Ur with Abraham establishing a covenant with and a belief in the oneness of God, and later the revelation of Moses with the Torah and the Ten Commandments focused on justice, moral conduct, service, and oneness to the oneness of the family and tribe. The Vedic Hindu era in India had many spiritual teachers and compiled beliefs, practices, and deities, like in the Rig Veda, representing cosmic order. By around 700 BCE, the Upanishads, and by around 400 BC, the Bhagavad Gita, with Krishna as the primary teacher, emphasized oneness with Brahman, or ultimate reality. In the Zoroastrian era in Persia, with the teachings of Zoroaster in the Avesta, brought a new level of spiritual discipline, ethical consciousness, and justice as the basis for a great new civilization. The Buddhist era, also in India, with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, or the Buddha, in the Dharmapada, emphasizing that treading the Noble Eightfold Path advanced humanity's understanding of liberating principles, mindfulness, compassion, ethical principles, and service to others. The Christian era in Galilee, with the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, including the Sermon on the Mount, exemplified God's love for all, served to promote unity and oneness on the prevailing social level of the city-state. In the Islamic era in Mecca, with the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran, focused on the submission to the will of God, conveyed a universality in accepting the previous Abrahamic prophets, and released a spiritual impulse that unified scattered tribal and desert peoples into a thriving Islamic national empire. And then with the Baha'i era in the 1850s in Iran, the teachings of Baha'u'llah in over 100 sacred texts released spiritual energies into the world designed to establish the spiritual principle of the oneness of humanity, with its supporting principles, the equality of women and men, the elimination of extremes of poverty and wealth, the elimination of all forms of prejudice, and other principles which are necessary for bringing about social justice, oneness, and peace on a global scale. So that is one way of getting a little better understanding that evolution in all realms is tied together, including in the realm of religion. As Abdu'l-Baha says here, just as the solar cycle has its 4 seasons, the cycle of the sun of reality has its distinct and successive periods. Each brings its springtime. When the sun of reality returns to quicken the world of mankind, a divine bounty descends from the heaven of generosity with new life. Minds are developed, aspirations become spiritual. It is the springtime of the inner world. So we live in a time of spiritual renewal, with spiritual epochs lasting anywhere from 5 to 12 centuries. We are only a century and 3/4 into the Baha'i era and have already seen a leap of consciousness from the previous norm of nation building to the new vision of an emerging global community. The spiritual energies of the Baha'i era are still in their early days, just beginning to blossom, changing this world into another world. So with this big picture perspective of humanity's evolution, we can see, as Robert Wright did here, that globalization, it seems to me, he said, has been in the cards, not just since the invention of the telegraph or the steamship or even the written word or the wheel, but since the invention of life. That's a pretty incredible concept or insight that Robert Wright was able to come up with from pretty much a research and scholarly perspective. And there's a lot implied in there, of course, concepts like teleology, or a sense of purpose to the creation, which, as we know, makes a great deal of sense. So also from this big picture perspective, we can take a look at our entire cultural, spiritual, and conscious evolution and see that it has taken a three-step process. The first step was our inherent consciousness of oneness. This is because the earliest indigenous communities were inherently unified by virtue of their common traditions, beliefs, and need to sustain their way of life. They lived with a consciousness of their oneness, as well as the oneness of all things around them. Indigenous peoples intrinsically know they are an integral part of the natural world around them. They intentionally live in union with this natural order. The second step is our adopted consciousness of duality. As societies became more complex, moved around, and came in contact with other societies, differences arose, their beliefs, values, and worldviews came into conflict, and struggle became the norm. The introduction of chaos, separation, and discord initiated a very long and painful period that eventually transformed our thinking into a pervasive consciousness of duality that has played out over many centuries, even millennia. And we're coming closer to the third step, which is our intended consciousness of oneness. Out of necessity for our collective survival, we are now in the midst of a slow but inevitable process of reclaiming our consciousness of oneness. We are already witnessing signs of a global economy, a global consciousness, and a sense of world citizenship, which are all the natural outcomes of where the realization of our interdependency as one human family has been leading us to an implementation of unity and diversity on its largest scale. So this big picture perspective helps us understand history's cycles. Humanity's conscious evolution is not just a linear progression from one point to another, or as it may sometimes appear, a linear regression. It is rather a purposeful process that includes cycles of upheaval leading to renewal within a pattern of linear progress. And we'll say much more about this idea in the third talk when we look at the nature of reality. So, what might we say would be the most challenging global issue of our time? Would that be moving beyond the dualities that separate us and toward the oneness that embraces all? That might be the greatest task at hand when we think of it in a global context. And I think this excerpt from the Promise of World Peace gives us a sense of that. World order can be found only on an unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind. Recognition of this truth requires the abandonment of prejudice of every kind: race, class, color, creed, nation, sex, degree of material civilization, everything which enables people to consider themselves superior to others. So the establishment of world order and the principle of the oneness of humanity takes in all the other challenging issues of our time. It's pretty clear that we need a new chapter to our revolving story. And we have one in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. As human consciousness has leapt forward from a localized perspective to an awareness of regional, national, and now international matters, our emerging consciousness of global integration, interconnectedness, has come much more into play and frames this new story of reality. The good news is that there are underlying principles that frame and guide our evolutionary leap and help us better understand the nature of evolution, find answers to the perplexing issues of our time, and become the framework for our evolving story, and also that give us hope for the future. A principle-centered approach, acknowledging our wholeness and interconnectedness, is essential to recognizing the new chapter in our evolving story. So these what I'm calling the 7 unifying principles of our time, frame the book, the story of our time, and really are taken from the world's wisdom traditions. And in each of these cases of the 7 principles that I've identified here, am providing just one quote from the Baha'i writings that in one way or another kind of supports or explains the principle. So we start off with the first one. Consciousness is a potentiality set in motion by an organic process. Now more than ever, the independent investigation of reality will unleash our full potential. And I think this is evident in Abdu'l-Baha's statement. We must investigate reality in order that by its light, the clouds and darkness may be dispelled. If the nations of the world investigate reality, they will agree and become united. The second principle, love is the underlying force of evolution. Love is the unifying force meant to evolve personal and collective potential to its highest degree. And the writings of all sacred traditions are filled with the role and place of love in our spiritual development. This is just one of those from Abdu'l-Baha. Love is the Holy Spirit's eternal breath, the vital bond inherent in the realities of things, the living link that uniteth God with man, the most great law, the supreme magnetic force that directeth the movements of the spheres. Principle 3, justice maintains the inherent balance of life. Equitable and just relationships on all levels evolve with the increase of social complexity over time. As Baha'u'llah has written, justice is the standard bearer of love and bounty. No radiance can compare with that of justice. So these first 3 principles are the ones we're going to continue to look at in today's talk. And the 4th through the 7th principles will be the ones that we come back to in the 2nd and the 3rd talks in the next 2 weeks. Principle 4, opposition is a catalyst for transformation. Opposing forces are necessary for growth, progress, and evolution, and exist to take us beyond their duality to a deeper unity. There are also many writings, sacred writings in the wisdom traditions of the world that support this. This is one from Baha'u'llah. Know ye that trials and tribulations have from time immemorial been the lot of the chosen ones of God and his beloved. This principle 4 is going to be the topic of the 2nd talk next week. Principle 5, reality is one and global harmony is inevitable. World peace is a promise waiting to be fulfilled. How we get there is up to us to determine. From Abdu'l-Baha, reality is one, and when found, it will unify all mankind. Principle 6, revelation is continuous and progressive. The release of spiritual energies always have been and will be the inspiration for the evolution of civilization. From Abdu'l-Baha, the organization of God is one. The evolution of existence is one. The divine system is one. And principle 7, consciousness evolves toward wholeness and unity. Consciousness, science and religion, as two knowledge systems within the same whole, cannot be in opposition to one another. And from Abdu'l-Baha, this endless universe is like the human body. All its parts are connected one with another and are linked together in the utmost perfection. So, a little look into the nature of consciousness. And again, this quote from B.D. Griffiths really is key to getting to this place of understanding that we want to be at. Only when our consciousness passes from its present dualistic mode, conditioned by time and space, will the new creation appear, which is the eternal reality of which our world is a mirror. So this quote by B.D. Griffiths reminds us of the three big steps humanity's conscious evolution has gone through, which I just referred to a little earlier. Beginning our existence in indigenous communities with a consciousness of oneness, then moving from that to a consciousness of duality for the next couple of millennia, few millennia, and now gradually moving back into an awareness of and a realization of the absolute necessity to live with a consciousness of oneness. Principle 1, again, this is about our evolving consciousness being designed to unfold by degrees and stages, ever transcending its own seeming limits. Yet the fulfillment of consciousness is not guaranteed. Its potentiality is wholly dependent upon the initiative we take to actively investigate reality. How our inherent urge to understand reality fulfills our potential has been written about, addressed by many poets and seers and writers throughout history. This is one example from Walt Whitman. Afoot and lighthearted, I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, a long brown path leading wherever I choose. So we are born into a mystery, one designed to pull at our heartstrings. As Elizabeth Gilbert, the author of the popular Eat, Pray, Love, puts it, perhaps somewhere within us is the itch, the mad and relentless urge to want to understand the workings of existence. This also reminds us of the archetype of the call to adventure, which signals the unfolding of destiny, the beginning of a transformational undertaking in which we are never left alone. Guidance is always present when most needed. So living within the world of dualities creates opposing forces in our lives, every moment of our lives, causing us to develop multiple identities and to be pulled in multiple directions. The longer our multiple identities stay separate and in opposition to one another, the longer will we stay in the world of dualities. Merging our multiple identities becomes a crucial part of our quest for a consciousness of oneness. If we could strip away all of our temporal identities, what would remain? The multiple identities we have become so familiar with, ethnicity, nationality, religion, gender, class, sexual orientation, and so on, are actually components of a greater wholeness within which we can regain our consciousness of oneness. Our physical, genetic, social, and psychological identities are who we are, but only for the limited time we are on this earth. If we took a more far-sighted view, what remains after we continue our eternal journey is our soul. Our true nature, our lasting identity, does not change. Taking on this holistic, unified identity tells us who we are in both the temporal and eternal realms. So we can see that consciousness expands with experience. It is a gift designed to help us see beyond what is evident, delve into the hidden meanings of the obvious, and extract the essence of what lies beneath the surface. The power of our own consciousness, reflecting upon itself, reveals how connected we all are, and brings us closer to the Creator at the same time. As the world's religions agree, seek and ye shall find even more than you thought. Seeking truth facilitates our own as well as society's transformation. Principle 2, coming back to that, and again from Rumi, all because of love. When it arrived, my temporal life from then on changed to eternal. And again, he's, as a mystic always does, he makes the distinction between the temporal realm and the eternal very, very clear here, and the difference that makes. So the direction of evolution's arrow has given life a trajectory that builds complex systems of cooperation and harmony out of simple and random interactions. Supporting this eternal process is the organic organizing force of love. Daily circumstances bring to light spontaneous expressions of empathy, compassion, altruistic care, and service to humanity. We can feel this divine force meant to evolve potential in our own lives. Love is the most powerful, attractive force in the universe. Love binds together all the natural elements. Love is the magnetic force that directs the movement of the planets. And we are made for transcending the illusion of separation. In fact, we're hardwired to connect, cooperate, and be empathic. Our greatest act in this world is to express love, compassion, caring, and charity in all things we do. All we have to do is bring to the surface what has been buried within us to fulfill our potential. And now we can know when the force of love and the power and knowledge of science combine, we know now that together they can eliminate all forms of prejudice. The discovery of DNA confirmed that there is only one human race and that we are among the most genetically similar of all species, and also that no one is more than 50th cousin to anyone else. The idea that there are human races is an illusion. Race is a biological fiction, yet it is a social fact with very real social consequences. Race as a plurality and a social construction was learned. We can unlearn this and replace it with the reality that race too is a unified whole. And this quote from Baha'u'llah is so important, such a key to moving from a consciousness of duality to a consciousness of oneness. Close your eyes to racial differences and welcome all with the light of oneness. We'll talk more about the light of oneness a little bit later. Actually, we'll close with some more reflection on that. But with that as a frame of reference, with oneness as a frame of reference, or our modus operandi, conflict, disunity, or estrangement between people would simply not be possible, would disappear. The realization of the oneness of the human race eliminates the notion that any one group is in some way more entitled than any other group. So we can see love as a transformative power. Mystics and saints have long known that love is the highest truth, that the universe comes from love, and that the universe is sustained by love. The power of love unveils the illusion of the physical world and takes us to the world of spiritual wonderment. As Abdu'l-Baha says here, love is the living link that unites God with humanity, the supreme magnetic force that directs the movements of the spheres in the celestial realms. So, the third principle. Here's another pretty interesting insight from Robert Wright. More souls are crammed onto this planet than ever, and there is the real prospect of great peril. Winning will depend on not wanting other people's to lose. He's got, within that thought, within that statement, he's got the concept of the oneness of humanity down, don't you think? So principle 3, justice is the embodiment of divine order on earth, a supreme force for moral rightness, equality, and harmony. Since antiquity, justice has been the cornerstone for the protection of human rights. Now, global justice is needed to harness the potentialities of globalization for the betterment of humanity. The challenge for achieving justice in our time is to turn toward oneness, to allow justice to become a force for unity. Cultural growth has always been toward oneness, as is evident in this traditional Lakota belief of we are all related. The intended unity we are at the threshold of is a deep understanding, acceptance, and putting into action of the concept of unity and diversity on its largest scale. Unity and diversity is not just a slogan, but a way of explaining the principle of the oneness of humanity. It honors all the natural and unique forms of diversity that exist within the human family and calls for a wider loyalty, putting the interests of a unified world first. So we really need to be able to see justice as the cornerstone for building a culture of oneness. As Shoghi Effendi says, a world growing to maturity must recognize the oneness and wholeness of human relationships and establish once and for all the machinery that can best incarnate this fundamental principle of its life. So we are now in the midst of the slow but inevitable process of reclaiming our consciousness of oneness. This transformation is evident in the notions such as global consciousness, global economy, and world citizenship. These are the natural outcomes of our evolutionary process. Living with the realization of our interdependency as one human community with one common heritage and destiny is the only sustainable worldview left to embrace. And a system of global justice is a most needed building block. A common thread of unity running throughout the world's sacred traditions is some form of the Golden Rule. With literally hundreds of versions of the Golden Rule across time, each one a basic human value and core ethical moral injunction, all reflecting a universal expression of our interconnectedness, such as, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It is not clear until the most recent spiritual epoch, the Baha'i era, however, what the real context of the Golden Rule is. Baha'u'llah makes that clear for us. If thine eyes be turned towards justice, choose thou for thy neighbor that which thou choosest for thyself. So the Golden Rule becomes justice in action, a sign of compassion in the world, finding its fulfillment in a standard of unconditional love. It is the foundation and framework for a principle of justice that evolves as social actions become more complex and the basis for a system of global justice. Justice is the equalizer in human affairs. It can moderate the extremes of wealth and poverty, create equality between women and men, remove the hurdles of national rivalries, prejudice, religious strife, economic barriers, and class distinctions. Without justice, none of those would be possible. This would require nothing less than the transformation of society, and this is the most needed form of community building in our time. Also required is the fundamental change of consciousness, which would include the wholehearted embrace of the principle of the oneness of humanity, laying aside self-interest, serving the common good, and contributing to the advancement of oppressed peoples. So what is the purpose of justice? Baha'u'llah again makes that quite clear. The light of men is justice. Quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny. Justice is a powerful force. It is the standard bearer of love and bounty. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men. So justice is the unifying force expressed in every dimension of reality. This is the promise of justice, the wholeness and unity that evolution has been leading us toward. As our circles of unity widen, the effects of justice deepen. Earlier in its evolution, justice could be characterized as a punitive system, utilizing an eye for an eye approach, which created the need for restorative justice. Indigenous communities, however, living in a web of interconnections, have always had a unitive system of justice with restorative justice built in to it because it simultaneously offered meaningful support to victims and helped perpetrators restore harmony in the community. This is a model that needs to be and is being writ large. The entire world community desperately needs a unitive system of justice designed explicitly to maintain unity on all levels and built upon the standard of compassion, respect, and equality for all human beings. So a universal system of global justice is required that includes the built-in ability to restore harmony by seeing through the eye of oneness and shifting our consciousness to see the whole first. Love and justice combined means unity right away, rather than needing more energy later to restore another injustice. An inclusive system of unitive justice is necessary for our very survival. The 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions declared that we commit ourselves to a culture of nonviolence, respect, justice, and peace. There is no global justice without truthfulness and humanness. To this, though, must be added, there can be no global justice without the recognition of the oneness of humanity. Carrying out global justice today based on oneness and interdependence is the only thing that will ensure the achievement of the purpose of justice. Establishing unity and diversity, the most practical need of our time. World unity is the goal. A fully functioning system of global justice is what will get us there. So, we've been along this path to oneness a while now, and when somewhere along that path to oneness, we eventually, gradually come to the realization that all separation is an illusion. All the divisive and counterbalancing parts that characterize all of life make up one unified reality. They are all held together by the same force that organizes and sustains the entire universe. This connective, creative energy, known as love, the divine spirit, or grace, is the underlying force expressed in every dimension of reality. And as we take a big picture view of humanity's history, we come also to the understanding that each divine revelation has moved us closer to the oneness that is possible now in our time. As Brother Wayne Teasdale put it, unity is the heart of all mysticisms. It is awareness of non-duality and non-separation. Knowing that our life is connected to all living things means we have no need to create opposition, to conquer, or to destroy. Going back to where we started, as one universal law governs all, the multitude of ways of seeing the universe eventually come together in one reality, one organic whole. As we approach fulfilling our potential individually and collectively, we witness a divine in everything, the wholeness and unity beyond all boundaries, and the veils of illusion burn away as a single glance reveals one creation. So I just want to close with one final kind of tool. And if you really want to make the shift from consciousness of duality to a consciousness of oneness, it's going to take a lot of work, some kind of regular practice, a regular spiritual practice, whether it's prayer, meditation, or yoga, or whatever it might be. When you get right down to it, all spiritual practice is some form of remembrance, remembering where we came from, remembering why we are here, remembering where we are going. At the heart of all remembrance is remembering that reality is one, that all of creation is a huge oneness. So I've come up with something that we can add to what we're already doing, what I call the Oneness Pledge. This can become like a mantra that we repeat regularly as often as needed to gradually shift our consciousness to that state and perspective of oneness. And then we can strive to keep it there. In all my thoughts and actions, I pledge to look on all things with the eye of oneness. If anyone is familiar with where that second part of this pledge comes from, let us know in write us a comment in the way you can on the web talk form. So that's about it. I think we have, hope we have time for some reflection and discussion, dialogue. Maybe we can turn this into one of those meaningful conversations that are so important right now.
I hope so. Thanks, Bob. This was a fascinating presentation, and I think it's sometimes very abstract for people to hear things at the level of principles with quotations. And so I would hope perhaps one of the parts of the discussion also could be figuring out how it applies also. I don't know if that's particularly useful or helpful, but that's certainly something I would like to see happen. It seems to me what we're talking about is a change of global culture. I guess that would be one way of putting it, using these principles. Is that sort of what you would say? How would you describe the big picture goal?
Definitely, it is both at the same time, an individual and a global process, kind of in harmony and in sync with each other. And you're totally right about figuring ways, practical ways that we can apply not only the principles themselves, but also the quotes that sort of support any of the principles. Of course, we've had this as a challenge all along, turning the abstract into the practical and the applicable. And so that really is an important next step kind of way to think about that. Yeah, for sure.
I'm looking at the questions here in two places at once, so that's why I'm looking several different places, because I'm checking our Facebook page as well while we go here, and I'm hoping to see if we have some comments from that. Shahla asks or comments, in recent times, each ethnic group has been trying to claim its own national identity. What do you think about this, considering that The Guardian has said that nation building has come to an end?
Yeah, that's great. And that's an issue topic that I do cover, and we'll be talking a bit about in the third talk in this series. But yeah, we've gone beyond the age of nation building, the age of nationalism, even though there are a few remnants of that left today still. Some people are trying to hold on to that, but we are beyond that. And the thing about those multiple identities that I went quickly through is that those are clearly and importantly part of our individual identity in this temporal realm, and important in the social world and realm that we live in every day. But it's kind of like, again, thinking of the evolution of this in terms of a developmental process. And so, and I think, and as a developmental psychologist, I think in those terms most often, most of the time. But so it's kind of like, the stages of human life. When we move from childhood to adolescence, we don't necessarily, I mean, many people think that we need to or should or do lose the qualities or the characteristics of who we were as a child. And the same thing might be said of when we leave adolescence and move into adulthood, that we lose some of our adolescent qualities, some of our childhood qualities. But that's really, I would think, a misunderstanding of the developmental process and where we are, and how that applies to the concept of our multiple identities. When we take on a larger identity, an all-inclusive identity of either world citizen or of our soul, that eternal part of us that is also our eternal identity. When we take on either of those, a world citizen, or the identity of the soul, we don't lose any of the others. They are still part of who we are, and we carry those with us. So it's not a matter of moving from a nationalistic or a national identity to a global identity and losing the former. It's a matter of both at the same time, but one is wider and more inclusive than the other.
Well, would that mean, for example, considering the current situation in Catalonia or Scotland or Quebec? I'm not sure if what I'm asking, perhaps the eye of oneness needs to be a focus of the Spanish and the Canadians and the British, or perhaps it needs to be the focus of the Catalans, the Scots, and the Quebecers, because it's an interesting issue of how to balance regional and national. And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that question based on all of this.
Yeah, obviously there's no easy answer. We would be there as a global community if there wasn't. I mean, on one hand, we do have the spiritual energies have been released in the last century and 3/4 that can take us there. But even with them, even with the latest revelation and release of spiritual energies, it's not an easy matter. But it's a matter of, again, it comes back to the level of principle. It's a matter of, in order to avoid those dualities, and those dualities getting in the way of anything, any progress or any interactions, we need to be able to see beyond those dualities, and in doing so, see the whole that they are a part of. So whether it's the Scots and English, or whatever set of national identities you want to look at, it's a matter of seeing that it really is a matter of both and the whole, both parts and the whole as a whole, and not one or the other. Somehow applying the principle of the oneness of humanity that is designed to make it, when it is applied and applicable, that principle, the oneness of humanity, is meant to make it easier for Scots and Brits to live together in harmony, and again, in any other geographic setting that you want to think of. So again, it goes back to the oneness pledge. If we can see with the eye of oneness, we have a better sense of what really is going on, and seeing with the eye of oneness is again, I think I may have mentioned this, it's about being able to see with or through the eye of God, and what's intended on a divine level or scale of things. So again, it's the challenge. One of the challenges in reaching and applying the principle of the oneness of humanity is going to be the degree to which all of us individually are able to see with the eye of oneness. And I don't know if anybody picked me up on my offer to, or if that phrase, the eye of oneness, is familiar with anyone, but that actually comes from the seven valleys of Baha'u'llah. It comes from the Valley of Unity. And that's, so if we're familiar with the seven valleys and the journey of the soul, that's another way of really, I mean, that's a huge way of taking that journey of the soul through the seven valleys. And when we get to the Valley of Unity, one of the things we realize is that that's where it becomes possible for us to see, to look upon all things with the eye of oneness. And once we come to that realization, then it's up to us, it becomes our challenge to apply that understanding to look on all things with the eye of oneness, as Baha'u'llah tells us is part of the characteristic or quality of being in the Valley of Unity. And then from there on, the remaining three valleys after the Valley of Unity are meant to, are really designed to help us stay in that consciousness of oneness, even though we're living in the world of duality at the same time.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're living in the world of duality at the same time is an important point, because in a way, recognition of the oneness of all things is not meant to blur distinctions as much as to see the duality in the context of the whole. Wouldn't you say?
Right, right. I mean, and this is another part of the challenge, is to be able to see all the parts and the whole with an equal importance, and recognize that when it ever becomes necessary to put one above the other, it becomes then a matter of putting the whole above any of the parts. I mean, you know, there's a lot. I'm sure other people can speak a lot more in detail and clarity about how that is done, but that's the principle.
Well, to take another practical example, I guess you could call it this: contemplating cows from the eye of oneness. Do we eat them?
Is that your question?
Ethical issue.
Well, yeah, definitely.
We're talking about the application of the oneness, the eye of oneness, to solve ethical. Right.
Right. No, that's a really interesting and good example. And I mean, the best way to kind of respond to that I know of would be, again, to bring in the indigenous perspective. And so it's a matter of, you know, people had throughout history, and especially in the earliest times, people had to live. They had to, and when they did live from wildlife or anything like that, even fish from the sea, it was always with a elevated sense of reverence for all created things. And so there was, as I understand it, there was always a prayer said for the cow or the fish or whatever it might be, and the recognition that they're part of the same creation we are, and so it part of the or one of the ways of working with that dichotomy, that challenge, and including the ethical part of it, is to acknowledge that all living creatures are part of the same creation, and all should be given the greatest respect and reverence.
That's a very good point. And I think that's a good answer. I think it's also worth pointing out that answer hasn't always worked in the past. I mean, that doesn't, not to say it shouldn't, but there are certainly stories of indigenous peoples driving herds of 10,000 bison over a cliff so they could eat 3 bison. But they didn't have to worry about running out of bison because there were 10 million of them.
Right. Well, I guess
Nowadays, we can worry about running out of bison.
yeah, I guess the principle of moderation comes in there somewhere too, with whatever the example might be. But so I mean, that's the other interesting thing. There's never only one principle to apply to any one given situation like that, whether it's an ethical situation or whatever it might be. There can be many spiritual principles to apply at the same time to the same circumstance or situation. And so, so that means whatever community you're part of, whether it's the indigenous communities or today in an urban setting, whatever it might be, we do need to get ourselves to a place of having access to knowledge of as many spiritual principles as we can to know which ones and how many of the ones we're aware of might come into play whenever we're making a decision or taking an action like that. But when we look at all of creation and all of its individual parts with the eye of oneness, it just puts everything in perspective, and going back to the example of the indigenous communities that I mentioned, and the way that they the way that they expressed reverence and respect toward whatever living creatures became part of their menu or whatever. It's the eye of oneness itself, and looking upon all things with that eye of oneness that allows us and gives us a greater appreciation for and recognition of the whole, as well as each of its individual parts.
John has a comment here. A recent thought that has occurred to me is that oneness is a fact and unity is the goal and aspiration. Now I'm seeing the path as recognizing oneness, then seeing and applying justice, then coming to unity. Also, I thought the eye of oneness could be gleaned from the last sentence of Baha'u'llah's words of wisdom.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I got all that or know what the question is, if there is a question
I think it's commented primarily that the eye of oneness is a recognition of a fact of unity, and the fact of oneness leads to the goal and aspiration of trying to determine how we can bring about unity.
Yeah, and that's very true. And oneness and unity are the same thing. I mean, just think of oneness and unity in terms of the human race. One of the primary overarching principle is the oneness of humanity. That could also be phrased as the unity of humanity, or unity and diversity of humanity. So yeah, those two terms are very similar and can be interchangeable, really.
Let's see, Perjaya commented about how Abdu'l-Baha said it's not kind to eat animals, and many indigenous people honored nature in their sacred ways before the Baha'i era, and we're progressing further into this new era and continuing to recognize the necessity of the light of this age. Just her take on it. She also was asking when we'd have this up on YouTube, and the answer is probably, certainly within 24 hours, we'll have it all up on YouTube. Some people, I guess, lost their video at one point. She did at one point, so she was able to get it back later. So that was that question. Seems to me that the light of oneness is also a very important perspective for justice. And turning back to this whole question of driving 10,000 bison over the cliff, if you've got to feed your kids, there's the justice to the kids to keep in mind too. If you don't have an easier way to make sure you can feed them in an era where you don't have the technology to just kill a few of them easily.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what to say there. I mean, and whether or not the example, I mean, that the example you used is somewhat familiar to me, but I'm not sure if it if it's being taken out of context in some way or what. But because it does seem like it's not really at the same time applying the principle of moderation, uh, which I'm sure indigenous peoples were aware of before the Baha'i revelation too. But so I guess that particular example depends on the context it happened in and everything. But um,
Yeah, on our Facebook page, there's some interesting comments too. Taliban notes that she's been thinking of ways of how to introduce these comments and from your talk in her presentations that she gives on peace education in the secular world. And there's always lots of injustices in that particular context, and it's very politicized. I don't know if you have any comments or suggestions about that. She also notes the difficulty of transcending racial narratives because of the spiritual immaturity of our society, because of all the cultural assumptions that build up race.
yeah, just a quick question before I get to that one. What is the rest of the screen? Does it show my slide or not?
It shows the story of our time slide and a background, a little tiny bit of the earth.
Oh, so the slideshow moved out of the slideshow. Let me put that back. Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Well, so I'm sorry. The first part of that comment
Well,
was
she was commenting that she does peace education about the politicized environment and the ever-present injustices that she's dealing with when she's trying to explain some of these concepts of peace education in a secular world. Certainly in a secular world, it's difficult to talk about the eye of oneness, I suppose. Maybe you have some ideas about that.
well, yeah. I mean, there's ways to work with or around that. I think, and so one way might be, rather than jump right in with the deep mystical concept like the light of oneness or the eye of oneness, it might be a little more practical and relatable if you brought in, and I'm sure this is done anyway, but an aspect of that mystical principle is also the oneness of humanity, which brings it to a more practical level. And there's many ways that we can make, I mean, the oneness of humanity is a principle that is both spiritual and mystical at the same time, and also at the heart of what our time today needs most to be able to survive the threats and the dangers that are all around us. And so starting out with the concept or the principle of the oneness of humanity, there are many, as we know from so many other resources, there are ways of making that concept of the oneness of humanity so much more practical. I mean, you can approach it from, as I think last week's web talk did, approach that concept from a population perspective. There's other, you can approach it from an economic perspective, but what I've been trying to do in my book and in the presentation is to kind of show how, when we keep the big picture perspective, that almost by definition keeps us beyond any of the opposing or conflicting dualities that exist in the world. Not always, but they may. I mean, it may help to maintain that big picture perspective, which means, again, look. I mean, so when I use the big picture perspective, I'm really saying that there is a way to understand. There's a way to make the past, the present, and the future more understandable. Not only the past, but the moment in time we're in right now, and the future as well, when we take that and keep that big picture perspective. So somehow, I mean, I know it's important to get to the details and specifics of economic, the economic aspect of it. It's important to get to the discrimination parts of things, all those pieces. But the greater whole is all the time about the oneness of humanity, which takes in all of the other kind of not necessarily sub, but all the other principles within the concept of they all come within the concept of the oneness of humanity. So I don't know, maybe somehow figuring out your own way to maintain that big picture perspective can be helpful. That's what I've tried to do with the book, and it's that's how I was able to kind of visualize the entirety of human history in those three major steps of starting out with a consciousness of oneness, being forced to shift to a consciousness of duality, and now out of necessity of our own survival, needing to shift back and reclaim our consciousness of oneness. But it's got to be that big picture understanding that moves people along. And that's another, we'll talk more about this in the third talk too, when I talk a bit about the global movement of our time. And I sort of referred to this earlier with the movements of the 60s, civil rights movements, women's movement, and the tremendous insight that Pete Seeger had at that time, 50 years ago or more. He understood, and others too, obviously, that all of those causes and movements they're all interconnected. They're all part of a greater cause, which is what we will talk a lot more about in the third talk of the series.
Good. Yeah, and I think you're quite right about this movement from a unified perspective to a duality, to a differentiation, you might say, of reality into many aspects that are all sort of sharply defined, and then back to the need to see everything as a whole. I think that's a very good point about human intellectual history, you might say. Lee Stewart, Lohras B says, thank you very much for your presentation. And that's basically the result. The remaining comments basically are various people saying thank you. So I think at this point, we'll switch back to my screen so that I can mention the upcoming talks. And then people will be able to hear about what's coming up next. We've just done the talk on November the 5th, of course, and now we're looking at November 12th, The Dark Night of the Collective Soul, a Baha'i Perspective on the Role and Purpose of Transformation in Society. And then on November 19th, Robert's series will close with Reality is One and Global Harmony is Inevitable, Building a Culture of Oneness. So we have these two remaining talks in the series. And then in December, we have a talk by Elena Mustakova-Posart about a psychology that responds to our times transforming inner oppression into awakened, aligned, and liberated spirit, which I suspect also has a lot to do with oneness here, so it probably relates. And then on December 10th, Reba Caruth will be giving the beginning of her 3-part series on the spiritual destiny of America and the West. And she will be looking at the history of European civilization, I think pretty much all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, which occurred 500 years ago. Just a few days ago, October 31st was supposedly the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. So Reba will be looking at all that. I should add, while we're looking at anniversaries, that today is the 60th anniversary of the passing of Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith. And I know many people, many Baha'is have been thinking about that today as well. And it's probably a good idea to acknowledge that particular event. I also want to mention something about our upcoming courses. Today, the Covenants of the Baha'i Faith course began, and there's plenty of room for more people to register for that. Our course on Baha'u'llah's Summons of the Lord of Hosts starts in 2 days, and that course really is looking quite good. We'll have a course on the Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha's book about renewing and revising and improving human society, starting on the 10th. And then a course on the equality of men and women starts on the 15th. So we have quite an interesting lineup there. Linking spiritual and physical intimacy in marriage is one of our new courses for the marriage and family department of the Wilmette Institute. And then we close out November with a course on 3 of the letters in the World Order of Baha'u'llah series by Shoghi Effendi, which we've titled this whole course Responding Effectively to Global Challenges, because the Universal House of Justice has asked the Baha'is in particular to study these 3 letters in order to understand the context we're living in. So, again, Bob, I want to thank you so much for your presentation today. It's fascinating. And I want to thank people for attending, and we look forward to seeing you next week right back here at the Wilmette Institute's Web Talk channel. Thank you very much, and have a good day.